Imagine the sound of 100,000 men moving stones in the dark. No shouts, no orders. Just the dragging of blocks that weighed more than elephants, sliding into their places as if they were floating. Workers swore they saw something impossible. Luminous figures helping to lift beams that 300 men couldn't move alone. Tools that should have broken in days lasted entire months. And when the sun rose, entire structures had appeared overnight, perfectly fitted without a single hammer mark. For 7 years, 183,000 men built something that had never existed before or since. It wasn't just a temple. It was a bridge between heaven and earth. 30,000 were cutting giant cedars in Lebanon. 70,000 were carrying stones taken from secret quarries under Jerusalem. 80,000 were sculpting in dark caves, praying not to be the next to die crushed. Some engraved their names in hidden corners, whispering, "I was here. I touched eternity." Today you will learn the story that no one tells, the real life of the forgotten men who built the Temple of Solomon. The recruitment and the journey to Lebanon. The order arrived like a silent thunder through the tribes of Israel. Solomon summoned 30,000 men, not soldiers but ordinary workers, farmers who left their crops, shepherds who abandoned their flocks, artisans who dropped their tools. According to the record in 1 Kings 5:13, the king sent messengers to every village, every city, every valley. It wasn't a request, it was a royal requisition. The men looked at their wives and children, knowing they would leave for an entire month. Adoniram, the supervisor of forced labor, organized endless lists of names. He divided the 30,000 into 3 groups of 10,000, each serving 1 month before returning home for 2 months. It was a perfectly synchronized human machine, spinning non-stop. The first batch of 10,000 men marched north for weeks, through stony valleys and arid plains, until the landscape changed completely. The mountains of Lebanon rose before them like green walls touching the clouds. When they entered the forest for the first time, silence swallowed them. Colossal trees rose towards the sky, cedars so wide that 20 men holding hands couldn't embrace them. Their trunks straight as columns of natural temples, their fragrance filling the air with a perfume that seemed sacred. Many fell to their knees, realizing they would touch something that God had planted centuries before. These cedars were older than their great-grandfathers, silent witnesses of entire generations. But the Israelites didn't know how to fell such giants. That's when Hiram, king of Tyre, fulfilled his promise to Solomon. As 1 Kings 5:6 records, he sent his best men, Phoenicians who were born among trees, who learned the secret language of wood from their fathers. These master loggers carried bronze axes as sharp as razors and jagged saws that sang as they cut. They taught the Israelites where to strike, how to read the inner rings of the tree when a giant was about to fall. They worked side by side, experienced Phoenicians guiding inexperienced hands, 2 nations united by a purpose that transcended borders. The alliance between Solomon and Hiram was not only political, it was practical, essential, alive. The rhythm settled in like heartbeats. 10,000 men worked while 20,000 rested at home. Every 30 days, a new batch climbed the mountains, replacing the exhausted ones who returned. For an entire month, they woke up before dawn, when the mist still covered the valleys. They felled cedars from sunrise to sunset, the echoes of the axes echoing through the mountains like distant drums. They ate hard bread and dried meat around bonfires, counting the days until they returned to embrace their families. Some fell ill from the cold of the altitudes. Others were injured when giant branches plummeted. But the system never stopped. While one group left, another was already on its way, keeping the forest always alive with the sound of human labor, transforming nature into divine glory. Felling the cedars was just the beginning. Moving them was where men broke. Each trunk weighed as much as 50 oxen together and needed to descend steep mountains to the sea. The Phoenicians taught ancestral techniques. They tied thick chains around the wood, poured oil on the trails to create natural slides, and used oxen in endless rows, pulling in perfect synchrony. Hundreds of men guided each trunk down the slope, shouting warnings when the speed increased dangerously. There were deaths, men crushed when ropes broke, others who disappeared into ravines when they lost control. But finally, as 1 Kings 5:9 describes, the logs reached the Mediterranean, where the Phoenicians tied them together, forming giant rafts that floated to Joppa. From there, Israelites dragged them up the mountain again to Jerusalem, where something impossible would be built with this wood that smelled of eternity. The secret quarries and the stonecutters. While men worked in the distant forests, others descended into the bowels of the earth. Under the hills around Jerusalem, explorers discovered something extraordinary: endless layers of perfect white limestone, hidden like treasures buried since creation. These underground quarries stretched like natural cathedrals beneath the surface, with high ceilings supported by pillars of virgin rock. The stone there was of superior quality, dense, uniform, without fractures or impurities that would make it fragile. Torches flickered on the walls, creating dancing shadows as men mapped the tunnels that would soon become the secret womb of the construction. It was as if God had prepared that place specifically for this moment, hiding the raw material of his temple exactly where it would be needed. 80,000 stonecutters descended into that perpetual darkness, transforming caves into underground factories. They worked by the light of oil lamps, the air thick with limestone dust that covered their bodies like grey snow. Their techniques came from generations. First they marked precise lines on the rock using ropes soaked in red paint. Then they drilled holes in sequence along these lines with bronze drills. They stuck dry wooden wedges in these holes and poured water. The wood slowly swelled, creating irresistible pressure that cracked the stone exactly where they planned. The sound was hypnotic, rhythmic hammering echoing through the tunnels, the sudden cracking when giant blocks separated from the mother wall. Each stone was cut with absolute precision still underground, as 1 Kings 6:7 reveals, prepared completely before seeing the light of day. The foundation stones were limestone monsters that defied the imagination. Some blocks measured 12 meters long by 4 meters high, weighing more than 15 adult elephants together. The cutters worked weeks on a single stone, making sure that every angle was perfect, every surface smooth as a mirror. When they finally separated these giants from the mother rock, the ground shook as if the earth were giving birth. Dozens of men rolled them over logs used as wheels, centimeter by centimeter, through tunnels widened especially for this. These stones would form the invisible base of the temple, buried deep where no one would see them, but everyone would know they were there, supporting the weight of God's glory. Some still exist today, mute witnesses in underground ruins, impressing archaeologists who cannot explain how they were moved. But something inexplicable happened in the depths. Bronze tools, soft compared to iron, should break after days cutting hard limestone. Drills should bend, blades should chip, handles should crack. But the workers whispered strange stories around bonfires on the surface. Chisels that cut for months without losing their edge, hammers that never cracked their wooden handles, saws that seemed to sharpen themselves overnight. Some swore that when working in the darkest hours, they felt their hands guided, their strokes becoming more precise than their skill allowed. Blacksmiths were perplexed when they examined the tools. They should be destroyed, but they remained almost new. It was as if something beyond human was preserving the instruments, ensuring that the sacred work did not stop due to mundane limitations of metallurgy. But the darkness also took its toll in blood. Collapses happened without warning. A support pillar cut in the wrong place, an invisible crack widening silently until tons of rock plunged onto men who had nowhere to run. The screams were muffled under the roar, followed by a silence worse than any sound. Rescue teams dug frantically with bleeding hands, but usually found only crushed bodies unrecognizable. Some men simply disappeared into tunnels that collapsed completely, sealing them forever in the bowels of the earth. Families waited on the surface, receiving only a torn and dust-stained tunic, as proof that their husbands, fathers, or sons had departed. There is no biblical record of the names of these men. Only the temple remained, built literally on the bones of anonymous workers who believed they were touching the sacred, even if it cost them their lives. The carriers and the impossible transport. 70,000 carriers formed the backbone of the impossible. As recorded in 1 Kings 5:15, these men were neither cutters nor artisans. They were pure brute force organized into teams that functioned as a single organism. Each team had its specialization. Some moved only small stones in woven wicker baskets, carrying them on their backs along steep trails. Others were dedicated exclusively to medium blocks, using poles passed under the stones with men on each end. The elite teams handled the giants, 50, 100, sometimes 200 men, tied to the same stone, moving in absolute synchrony. They had their own leaders, men with powerful voices who shouted rhythmic commands, "Pull! Hold, pull, hold!" They created work songs to maintain the rhythm, repetitive melodies that echoed through the site from dawn to dusk, transforming labor into ritual. The engineering was primitive but ingenious. They built colossal ramps of compacted earth that gradually climbed to the level where each stone would be placed, some reaching dizzying heights as the temple grew. Thick ropes of ox leather, braided until they were strong as chains, were tied around the blocks with knots that only the Phoenicians knew. Under the stones, they placed enormous sleds of reinforced wood, and under the sleds, round logs serving as primitive wheels. They poured animal fat or oil on the ramps, making them slippery. The system required perfect coordination. If half the men pulled harder than the other half, the stone would turn and roll back, crushing dozens. Accidents happened. Ropes snapped under extreme tension, whipping through the air and beheading anyone nearby. Sleds cracked, dumping blocks of several tons that rolled like avalanche stones, massacring everything in their path. But then the strange stories began. Workers who left stones positioned at the end of the day swore that the next morning they had moved. Not centimeters, but entire meters, perfectly aligned in their final places. Blocks that 200 men couldn't lift during an entire day mysteriously appeared elevated at dawn, fitted with millimeter precision that no human carpenter would achieve. Some carriers whispered that they deliberately marked the positions with smaller stones before leaving, and upon returning, they found the giants displaced exactly where they should be, as if invisible forces worked night shifts. The supervisors reprimanded these conversations, but could not deny the inexplicable progress. Stones that would take a week to position were ready in one night. The schedule accelerated in ways that the planners had not foreseen, as if time itself was being manipulated. The night watchmen were the only ones who saw. Men positioned to protect tools and materials against thieves reported visions that made them tremble. Tall figures, luminescent like metal heated to red hot, walking silently between the stones. They didn't cast shadows in the moonlight. They moved with purpose, touching blocks that then slid smoothly as if they weighed nothing. Some watchmen fled in terror, abandoning their posts. Others fell to their knees, covering their faces, convinced that they were witnessing angels fulfilling divine orders. In the morning, they tried to tell what they saw, but the words failed. How to describe light that doesn't burn, movement without sound, force that doesn't require effort? The supervisors accused them of sleeping and dreaming, but did not explain how the work advanced on its own. The workers came to believe that they were not just building a temple, they were collaborating with heaven. Coordinating 70,000 men without modern communication required a system that functioned as its own language. They developed codes of shouts that crossed the entire site. A long shout meant stop immediately. 2 short ones followed meant retreat. 3 quick ones warned danger of falling. Signalers were positioned at strategic points, repeating the commands like human echoes so that they reached distant teams. They also used colored flags, red for emergency, blue for change of direction, white for rest. At night, lit torches moved in specific patterns, transmitted messages through the darkness. The master builders carried ram's horns that they blew in different sequences. A long note gathered all the supervisors. Repeated notes indicated a change of shift. This complex system transformed potential chaos into choreography, allowing thousands of men to move colossal objects with the precision of a single craftsman working on a small piece. It was noisy, primitive, but it worked. The Tower of Babel in reverse, where confusion of tongues became harmony of purpose. The construction of the temple and life on the site. The most impressive thing was not the noise, but the silence. When the stones finally arrived at the construction site, something extraordinary happened. As Verfirst Kings 6:7 clearly documents, neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. Each stone already came perfectly cut from the underground quarries. Each cedar beam arrived measured and sculpted from Lebanon. The workers simply fitted the blocks together like a giant puzzle, each piece sliding into its predetermined place with supernatural precision. The sound was only of heavy breaths, of ropes being strained, of wood scraping against wood. Visitors who arrived at the mount expecting to hear the typical construction chaos were perplexed by that reverent quiet. It was as if God himself had ordered silence while his house took shape. The noisy work happened far away in the forests and caves, but here, in the holy place, only whispers and the soft dragging of stones were allowed. Around the central site, a temporary city sprouted like mushrooms after rain. 183,000 men needed to sleep, eat, live. Tents of thick fabric and goat leather covered the surrounding valleys, creating mazes of improvised streets where women sold bread, children ran between the mooring ropes, and bonfires punctuated the night like fallen stars. The logistics of feeding this crowd was a military operation. Endless caravans brought wheat, barley, oil, and wine from the agricultural regions. Bakers worked in ovens that never cooled, baking thousands of loaves of bread daily. Entire flocks of sheep and goats were slaughtered to provide meat, their hides transformed into wineskins and ropes. 2 rivers of supplies flowed constantly, one of construction materials, the other of food. The supervisors administered rations carefully. Each man received his portion in the morning, enough to maintain strength but not to waste. It was a delicate dance between necessary abundance and ever-threatening scarcity. But among the anonymous carriers worked true artists. Specialized metallurgists, brought especially from Tyre like Hiram-Abi, the master blacksmith mentioned in 1 Kings 7:14, created bronze wonders, massive columns decorated with pomegranates and lilies, a giant circular basin supported by 12 cast metal oxen, each looking in a different direction. Carvers transformed cedar into 3-dimensional gardens, flowers, palm leaves, cherubs, with outstretched wings emerging from the wood as if they had always lived there. Weavers created veils and curtains of fine linen dyed blue, purple, and crimson, embroidered with gold threads that captured the light like water in motion. These artisans worked for years on unique pieces, their hands guided by skills passed down through generations, creating objects that transcended function to become solidified worship. While thousands sweated moving stones, these few whispered prayers as their fingers danced on metal and wood. In hidden corners, where supervisors weren't watching, ordinary workers committed small acts of immortality. With chisel tips, they engraved their names in archaic Hebrew on the back of stones that would soon be covered by others. Ezra, son of Joachim, was here. Micah touched this stone in the 10th year of Solomon. They knew that no one would see these marks for centuries, perhaps millennia, but they needed to leave proof that they existed. They weren't just anonymous muscles. They were men with stories, with families, with dreams of being remembered. Some drew simple symbols, a hand, a star, a fish. Others wrote brief prayers, "May Yahweh remember me." Modern archaeologists still occasionally find these marks on ancient stones, silent voices crossing 3,000 years of oblivion, finally fulfilling their purpose, to be recognized, to be seen, to prove those men lived and touched the sacred. But glory came at the price of blood. Wooden scaffolds rose dozens of meters high, tied with ropes that rotted under sun and rain. Men worked on narrow platforms without any protection. One false step, one rotten plank, and the scream would end with a horrible impact against the stones below. Bodies were collected silently to not demoralize other workers, quickly buried in mass graves without elaborate ceremonies. Giant cedar logs also killed. As they were raised by primitive pulleys, ropes would break and tons of wood would plummet like divine spears, impaling or crushing anyone underneath. There were cases of men who survived the fall, but were permanently crippled, dragging themselves through the tents as living reminders of the risks. No one recorded how many died. The Bible doesn't mention the fallen, only the completed building. But somewhere beneath Jerusalem, anonymous bones still rest. Human foundations of a divine temple, men who literally gave their lives so that God's glory would have an earthly address. The final 7 years and the legacy of the builders. In the final months, artisans performed the most delicate work, covering the interior with pure gold. As 1 Kings 6:20-22 describes, the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place where the ark would rest, was completely covered with 600 talents of gold, approximately 20 tons of precious metal hammered into sheets as thin as onion skin. They beat the gold until it was translucent, then carefully nailed it over the carved cedar, covering every inch of wall, ceiling, and floor. Under the light of lamps, the entire room shone as if made of solidified light. The giant cherubim, each one 5 meters tall, their wings touching in the center, also received layers of gold. Only ritually purified men could enter to perform this work. wearing special sandals so as not to scratch the golden floor. They worked in reverent silence, aware that they were preparing the room where God himself would dwell. The air smelled of metal and incense, and they said that some artisans left there transformed, unable to speak for hours. Behind all the coordinated work was a rigid hierarchy. According to 1 Kings 5:16, 3,300 foremen supervised the working masses, forming layers of authority that ensured that every order from Solomon reached the last stone carrier. They were tough men, chosen for their competence and ability to inspire fear and respect simultaneously. They carried rods not only as symbols of authority, but as tools of discipline. Lazy or incompetent workers felt their strength. They moved constantly through the site, checking quality, adjusting schedules, resolving disputes between teams. They had their own supervisors above them, who reported directly to the main architects, who answered only to the king. It was a bureaucratic machine that functioned with military efficiency, transforming one man's vision into reality through the coordination of nearly 200,000. Without these foremen, the project would have collapsed into chaos. They were the nerves connecting the brain to the muscles. And then, after exactly 7 years, as 1 Kings 6:38 records, it was complete. The last piece of gold was fixed, the last notch checked, the last curtain hung. For the first time, workers stopped and simply looked. What they had built left them speechless. The temple stood majestic on Mount Moriah, its white limestone walls reflecting the sun like mountain snow, its double cypress doors encrusted with gold, capturing the light in blinding bursts. It measured 60 cubits long, 20 wide, 30 high, not huge compared to palaces in other nations, but perfect in proportion, each measurement harmonious with the others. In the distance it seemed to float, a vision between heaven and earth. Men who had worked 7 years seeing only individual stones now saw the totality, and many wept openly. They had built something that completely transcended them, something that would remain when their great-grandchildren were dust. When it was all over, the 183,000 took different paths. Most returned to their villages, carrying worn tools and memories that they would tell their grandchildren. I carried stones for Solomon's temple. They returned to plows and herds, to ordinary lives after touching the extraordinary. But thousands remained in Jerusalem, settling in the surrounding areas, unable to abandon the place where they had left pieces of themselves. Some became temple guards, others vendors in the market that grew around it. Others simply lived nearby, visiting daily to touch the stones they once moved. They created a community of construction veterans, sharing stories that always started the same. When I worked on God's house, their children grew up in the shadow of the temple, learning early on that their parents had done something that would remain when empires crumbled. But beyond pride and exhaustion, something deeper marked these men forever, the unwavering certainty that they had touched eternity. It didn't matter that their hands were calloused and their names forgotten. Each stone carried, each strike of the chisel, each drop of sweat had become part of something that transcended death. When the glory of God descended like a cloud during the dedication of the temple, as 1 Kings 8:10-11 records, filling the place until the priests could not remain, the workers understood. They had not simply piled up stones, they had built a bridge between worlds. Old men on their deathbeds whispered to their sons, "My hands touched where God would dwell." They believed that their souls were intertwined with those walls, that as long as the temple remained, part of them would also remain. And even when Babylonians destroyed it centuries later, the memory persisted, because they didn't just build a building, they built themselves into God's eternal narrative with humanity, anonymous but unforgettable, mortals who left marks on the eternal. If this incredible story of the men who built Solomon's temple touched your heart, imagine the treasures waiting. In our next videos, these workers believed they were building something eternal, and they were right. Their legacy continues to inspire us thousands of years later. Subscribe to our channel right now so you don't miss the amazing biblical stories we share every week. Hit that notification bell to be the first to watch our new content. And if this video blessed you, share it with someone who needs to hear about God's magnificent works throughout history. Remember, just like those ancient workers who each placed their stone in God's temple, when you share this video, you're helping build something bigger. You're spreading God's word to hearts that need it. Click subscribe now, share this video with your friends and family, and let's continue discovering these incredible biblical stories together. God bless you and see you in the next video.